Hey, just in case you're not aware, I did launch a new second Actualized channel recently called Actualized Clips. If you're not aware of that, go check it out. There's a link down below. Subscribe. All right, now let's get into the serious topic of making sense of Jordan Peterson. This is going to be an advanced, very nuanced analysis of Jordan Peterson. Why are we talking about him and who is he? Well, Jordan Peterson is a very well-known public intellectual, psychologist, professor, academic. He has a lot of content on YouTube. He has a very big following. He's made a lot of waves in the cultural zeitgeist in the last 4 or 5 years or so. And he has a lot of influence on young people. He teaches psychology, personal development type stuff, self-help stuff, some religious and spiritual topics, and he has some political takes, which are probably the most controversial part of his work. So we're going to be covering the full gamut here of all of these. And I think it's important because he has such a big following. A lot of people listen to him, trust him, rely on his ideas and opinions. And there are important traps that I want to point out about that. Now, this analysis here is going to be non-partisan. It's going to be non-ideological. I'm being very deliberate to set aside all of my biases and prejudices and to be very accurate in the analysis. So I will be as even-handed as possible. I'm not just going to be coming at it from a sort of a bashing of Jordan Peterson. And that's a lot of what the critiques of Jordan Peterson are. There's a lot of critiques of him on YouTube. He's been critiqued to death. And in some way, I feel sorry for him because it's hard to take all these slings and arrows. It's not easy to be him. But I mean, he's compensated well for it. He makes millions of dollars and he has a big audience, lots of clicks. So there's pros and cons to that, lots of fame. But anyways, what I see, and I must admit, I fell into this trap a bit myself, is that I see a lot of critiques of Jordan Peterson's work coming from the left, especially progressives and socialist types of people, because they object to some of his conservative political positions. And in that sense, I too object to some of his political positions. I think that his political part of his work is the weakest of his work. And you might be wondering, well, like Leo, in the past, you've said negative things about him. Yeah, I have, mostly related to his political takes and to his misunderstanding of progressivism. So we'll be talking about all this in a lot of detail. I'm just kind of setting this up for you. Don't worry, there's going to be a lot of explanation and logic and evidence that I will provide. So the problem, though, is that Jordan Peterson's work is predominantly psychology and spirituality and philosophy and self-help type stuff. And I mean, actually, it's not a problem. It's a great thing. And recently, to do this episode properly, I went and I watched some of his non-political stuff. And I was actually quite surprised at how good it is. So if I was just looking at his his philosophy and his psychology, there's a lot of good, useful stuff there. And I can see why people love it and people get value from it. I've gotten value from it. For example, he talks a lot about the Big Five personality profile, psychological test. And I learned that from him some years ago. And that's very useful and valuable to know. He has a lot of this kind of like technical psychological understanding. And actually, a lot of the stuff he teaches is very much what I teach. Psychology, philosophy, even delving a bit into metaphysics and epistemology, spirituality. That's what I teach. That's my passion. I just come at it from a different perspective and a different angle. So if you're a Jordan Peterson fan and you're following his work, don't be threatened by this. This is not going to be some sort of partisan critique of him. I will help you to understand why Jordan Peterson's work resonates with you, why it's resonating in the cultural zeitgeist, why he's so popular. And then I will also talk about various shadows within his work, limitations, and how you can go beyond those, and really things that he is not able to teach you because he doesn't fully understand yet. And I'll explain that to you. So this is not to bash Jordan Peterson. That's not the point here. The point is simply to give you a very big picture context of what's really going on, why people are so into Jordan Peterson, and also things they get wrong about Jordan Peterson. I'll be talking about things that conservatives get wrong about Jordan Peterson, and I'll be talking about things Jordan Peterson gets wrong about himself, and I'll also be talking about what progressives get wrong about Jordan Peterson, and I'll also be talking about what Jordan Peterson gets wrong about progressives. So we're going to cover this from all angles here. All right. But to do that, we need to introduce the model called spiral dynamics. Fans of mine should be already very familiar with that, but if you're new and you've never heard of spiral dynamics, I have like a 10-hour series on spiral dynamics. Search for it. You'll find it. Watch it. But I'll give a little brief recap of it here because it's going to be central for being able to make sense of the big picture of what's going on politically, culturally, and intellectually in our society and how Jordan Peterson fits into that. So what spiral dynamics is it's a psychological model coming from the field of developmental psychology. And Jordan Peterson himself talks about certain aspects of developmental psychology, such as various stages of childhood development, Piaget, and things like that. Maybe you've heard of those things. But he, from what I understand, he doesn't understand spiral dynamics. He's not even aware that it exists. So these stages I'll be using to describe him, this is something I'm introducing to the situation to help us make sense of it. All right, so spiral dynamics is a model that was developed by Claire Graves and by Don Beck and Christopher Cohen. And this model maps the psychological development and evolution of the human psyche. And it doesn't just do that at an individual level, it also does it at a collective level for entire cultures and societies across the last, let's say, 2,000 years of human history. And so what's interesting about this model is that it tells us that there's a very predictable set of stages that a psyche goes through, and these stages are defined by one's values. At each stage, your values are different, and they evolve, and they expand, they become more complex and nuanced with each stage. Think of each stage as kind of moving upwards. But also, these stages are not mutually exclusive in the sense that you move out of one stage and you leave it behind into another. They build on top of each other. So really think of it like building a skyscraper. Each floor builds on top of the next. So what are these stages? They're color-coded to make them easier to remember. I'm not going to mention all of them. Spiral dynamics is a very complex model. It can take you 20, 30 hours to start to understand. It's very nuanced. This is just a summary here, a basic summary. This is all you need. Stage red, we'll start there. That's the lowest one we'll be talking about here. Stage red, next stage blue, stage orange, stage green, stage yellow, and stage turquoise. So that's like 6 stages. So stage red is, you might think of it as the warlord stage. This is back during the ancient Roman times when city-states were attacking each other, conquering and pillaging and enslaving each other. It's that kind of mentality. A lot of that exists, for example, today with drug cartels in Mexico. They tend to be very violent, and they tend to resolve their differences with physical violence and domination. It's a very egocentric stage. We might call it egocentric red. Once society has had enough of that, it transcends that stage and moves into the next one, which is stage blue. Stage blue is very easy to understand. It's the religious stage. These are the religious ideologues. Not exclusively religious ideologues, but that is a good stereotype of it. Think of it as the Mike Pences of the world or the Ned Flanderses of the world. So think of Ned Flanders. I don't know, do you Zoomers even watch The Simpsons anymore? Do you even, are my references outdated? Hopefully you know who Ned Flanders is. So I mean, what is Ned Flanders? Ned Flanders is the sort of stereotypical stage blue. He is this sort of good Samaritan. He's a good Christian. He follows all the proper Christian protocols and rules. And he obeys all the laws. He's very conscientious. He's very dutiful. He's very disciplined and very religious. And he's all about family values. and following the proper norms, etiquette, personal responsibility, part of a community like a church community that he goes to. This is prototypical stage blue. Now, of course, stage blue is not limited to Christianity. It can also include Islam or any religion. It doesn't matter. That's just sort of like a flavor difference of what religion you happen to subscribe to. But generally, stage blue are theistic people who are God-fearing people who believe in an afterlife and are worried about upsetting their God, whatever God they pray to, and they take that stuff seriously. It's not a joke to them. That grounds their life. Then, once you exhaust the limits of that stage, you evolve to the next stage, which is stage orange. Stage orange is the materialistic, scientific, rationalist, logical, success-oriented stage. Think of, as the sort of prototypical example of this, think of the Wolf of Wall Street, or just Wall Street in general. People who are only after material success, money, fame, personal achievement. They're not constrained by religious morals because they think religious morality is just some sort of superstition from our ancestors. It's unscientific, it's irrational. These are people who pride themselves on their rationality and their scientific understanding of the world, and they subscribe to a materialist worldview. They look at the world as a mechanical system, like a clockwork that can be manipulated to one's own personal advantage. And so they do that. Now, what's important to understand is that each of these stages, you have to be careful not to judge it as good or bad. They're not good or bad. Each stage can have healthy and unhealthy manifestations of it. Each stage has a whole value set, and this value set is like a worldview, and it really shapes how you see reality. Each stage is like being in a different reality a bit. It's like having different colored glasses on with each stage, and then you upgrade those glasses and you see the world differently, and it colors everything that you do. It colors what you think is worthwhile to pursue, what you think is meaningful, what you think isn't meaningful, what you think is true, what you think is false, and so on. And these things change quite radically as you move up the stages. But it's important to understand that you can go overboard with any stage. For example, you can have religious fanaticism that goes into terrorism or into racism and nationalistic, like Nazism, at stage blue. If it gets out of hand, that doesn't mean stage blue is evil, just because Nazis are evil or whatever you might think. Likewise with stage orange can be a healthy stage, and all these stages are necessary. But it can also become toxic, sort of like you see in Wolf of Wall Street and some of the abuses on Wall Street and various kinds of predatory capitalism, where drug companies are exploiting you and other companies are exploiting you and forming monopolies and these sorts of things, and where in general our whole society becomes about just the pursuit of money and success, and that becomes very shallow and hollow. And then once that stage is exhausted, you can move up into stage green. Now, stage green is the stage that Jordan Peterson has the most problem with, and I think his followers have the most problem with, which is the social justice warrior stage. This is the stage of hippies, people who smoke pot, people who are more loose, people who are maybe quasi-spiritual, maybe a bit new agey, people who are concerned about equality and fairness in the world. Stage green is very much worried about all the oppression that is happening and all the inequality in the world. It's worried about the poor people, it's worried about the animals. Stage green has an expanded sense of compassion. There's an opening of the heart when you get to stage green. And you start to realize how selfish you were your whole life, only worried about you or your little tribe. And so stage green expands its circle of concern to include not just oneself or one's family or one's church or one's religion or one's nation, but the entire globe. Stage green cares about not just one's own culture, but all cultures. That's why it's very multicultural. It cares about not just one's own race, but all races, not just one's own ethnicity, all ethnicity, not just one language, all languages. That's a very significant shift in perspective and orientation in the world. Stage green includes a lot of the socialists, a lot of the social democrats, a lot of the progressives, some liberals. It includes the postmodernists, the cultural Marxists that Jordan Peterson rails against. That's all stage green. And then there's yellow and other stages. We'll get to that as we keep talking. So let's just work with these stages. Why did I just spend 10 minutes explaining this to you, you might think? Because if you understand this, you're going to understand everything that's going on with Jordan Peterson and with yourself and with the culture wars and the entire political situation that's been happening over the last 5 or 10 years. It's very, very helpful for making sense of reality. So, why is Jordan Peterson's work so popular, and why does it resonate with people so much? Because especially in Western developed countries, in America, in Canada, Northern Europe, the center of gravity of our culture and our society is roughly stage orange. Some people skew a bit from orange to blue, and some skew a bit from orange up to green. And so what we have in our culture is we have a culture war between these two factions. People have segregated themselves into these two factions. The ones that lean a little bit more green are fighting against the ones that lean a little bit more blue, and the ones that are a little bit more blue are fighting against the ones that are a little bit more green. So what's characteristic of all these stages is that when you're in this stage, you're not aware that you're in this stage. And therefore, when you look from your stage to another stage, especially if you're looking multiple stages across, or even just one stage across, the worldview of that person seems so radically different from yours that you tend to think of those people as stupid, crazy, criminal, or insane. Because it doesn't make sense within your worldview. For example, when a stage blue religious ideologue looks at a social justice warrior, gay, trans, whatever person, socialist, they look at that and they think that person is insane. And then when this socialist person looks back at the stage blue religious ideologue, he thinks that religious ideologue is very regressive and outdated and traditional in his worldview. And so both of them misunderstand each other, and then this is what creates conflict. It's simply a lack of misunderstanding and a refusal to move up the stages and to integrate all of the stages into yourself. Remember, it's not that blue is worse or green is better. It's all a matter of perspective, and all of them are necessary. So to have a healthy green, you have to actually build it on top of a healthy orange and a healthy blue. You can't just reject orange and blue, and that's a mistake sometimes green people make. So back to the point here. Society's center of gravity, let's say, in the developed world is around stage orange, maybe even skewing a bit more green. And where Jordan Peterson comes in is that he talks a lot about the values that are latent within religion and within ancient traditions, the Bible and other spiritual texts. He talks about that a lot. Why? Because what's happened is that a lot of, especially youngsters these days, Zoomers who are in university, and especially in academia is a stronghold for stage green. That's the postmodernism stuff, that's the gender rights stuff, that's the anti-racism stuff, that's the Antifa stuff, all that. Socialism, Marxism, all of that. And Jordan Peterson worked and grew up sort of in that environment. He's made his career in that environment, teaching in that environment, teaching to kids, to youngsters in that environment. And what he's noticed is that those youngsters at stage green, they lacked a foundation in stage orange and stage blue because they were reacting against it. These stages is actually very easy because these stages are sort of a cultural milieu in which you are born and into which you are indoctrinated, like a fish into water. And so if you grow up in a very liberal part of the country, progressive part of the country, a big city, or you go to a big university, then you're going to be fed the sort of ideology of progressivism and stage green, that value system, but you're going to probably miss out on valuable and important lessons from the orange and blue and lower value system. And then because of that, your life will be lopsided and you will not be able to find a sense of direction in your life. You might get lost in moral relativism, not knowing what's good, what's bad anymore. You might get lost in the confusion of gender binary, non-binary gender fluidity, where you're not even sure if you're male or female, and this confuses you as a kid when you're young. And then you're trying to make sense of all this, and it's difficult. And then because of this, you're not getting the kind of personal success that you want in your life. And then you might get depressed, you might get anxiety, you might have relationship problems, you might not be able to do well in a marriage, you might not be able to raise your kids properly, and all these sorts of things that Jordan Peterson rightly points out. And this is a legitimate concern. And in this sense, he's doing good and he's serving an important function, because a lot of people in society these days are missing out on those traditional values. Think of stage blue traditional values as what your grandparents were educated into, and maybe even your parents. Things like family values, fear of God, being a good person, being loyal, being dedicated and hardworking, waking up on time, doing your chores on time, being dutiful, being responsible, being honest, being polite. Basically, Ned Flanders. Now, you might say to yourself, well, I don't want to be like Ned Flanders. That's ridiculous. Yeah, it's a caricature. Ned Flanders is a caricature. You don't have to be Ned Flanders. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what you should see is that there's value to some of the qualities of Ned Flanders. Now, he takes it too far. Every one of these stages can take it too far. But what Jordan Peterson is actually pointing out to you, if you're stage green or even above that or even below, whatever, but what he's pointing out is that you've probably missed out on important lessons from stage blue. And then when you actually hear that from him, because you don't get it anywhere else in the culture, because the culture has moved on from blue and has sort of neglected blue. And so what Jordan Peterson's whole function is in society as a public intellectual is to just remind us, like, hey guys, don't forget about stage blue. There's important stuff there. Don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sure, you might think that God doesn't exist, or you might think that some of the stuff in stage blue isn't very good or it's superstitious, but it's not just pure superstition. It's not just old hokey ideas. There was actually something important there. For example, the ability to discipline yourself and to have work ethic. This is important. And if you don't develop that, you're not going to have a healthy stage green. After all, how can you become this effective socialist and Marxist and fight against racism and other things when you can't even discipline yourself to wake up on time in the morning or to go to work or to handle your finances? This is where Jordan Peterson gives you advice such as clean your room. And of course, that's correct. That's correct advice. You need to be able to clean your room. But there's more to it. We'll discuss that as we go. There's more to just being a good human than cleaning your room and taking care of your own personal stuff. But since you are sort of the atom of your life, everything in your life hinges upon you. If you don't get this thing right here, if you can't discipline yourself, you can't wake up in the morning, you can't feed yourself properly, you can't be dutiful, then you can't really grow beyond that. And it's going to lead to dysfunctions within your personal life and also in your family life and in your society if everybody's doing that. And that's what Jordan Peterson is really trying to point out to you. And that is valid and that is important. The mistake that stage green and orange people have made is that they have dismissed the importance of stage blue. They've demonized it and made a shadow out of it. And what I mean by that is that there are certain aspects of stage blue that they don't like. And it's easy to make a straw man out of any of these stages. So the straw man that we can make out of stage blue is that they're fascists, they're racists, they're nationalists, they're Nazis, they are intolerant, they're hateful. This is the typical straw man that progressives make of stage blue conservatives. And it's easy to make that straw man because when you look through human history, you can see a lot of the excesses of stage blue, which were very nasty and murderous and oppressive. You see things like slavery and racism and nationalism and xenophobia and genocide and ethnic cleansing. These all stem from stage blue. You see holy wars waged from stage blue because at stage blue, a society is theocratic. It tends to believe that its religion is the only true one and all the other ones are Satan worship. And so naturally then it wants to defeat them and have a monopoly on religion. So what happens with these stages is that the stage is played out to the hilt until it becomes so extreme and so excessive that all of us collectively recognize that, it's gone too far. And that happened, for example, with stage blue over the last couple hundred years. We've had so many holy wars. We've had so many genocides. We've had World War II, effectively started by stage blue Nazis. And many other examples like this that could be cited. We've had all these examples, and we've seen that it's too limited. It produces too much suffering. And so America itself was actually founded on sort of a radical stage orange idea of religious tolerance. America is not founded on the idea that America is exclusively Christian. It's founded on the idea that we've had societies in the past where they were theocratic and it led to suffering and evil. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to stop. We're just going to stop, like right from the beginning, we're going to stop this at its root, this idea that you should kill people for differences in religion. And so now, today, very few people in America and in the developed world get killed for differences of religion. We expect religious tolerance. That's actually written into the Constitution because the framers of the Constitution were actually pretty advanced, cutting-edge stage orange thinkers. And back then, stage orange was not a very common stage. The Constitution is not a stage blue document. But anyways, so we've evolved beyond that, but now we're living in this sort of materialistic stage orange worldview. And that's great. There are some great aspects to that because it's more scientific, it's more rational, and it's true that there were certain superstitions and irrational aspects that were unscientific and even untrue in the stage blue worldview. That's correct. And the stage blue worldview tends to be very dogmatic and intolerant at its extreme. And that becomes a problem. So you transcend that with stage orange. You have a more global mindset, a more scientific mindset, and that's good. And you might think, well, great, that's it. We're done. But we're not done. Because, and here's where Jordan Peterson comes in, is he would say, now all you're living for is you're living for materialism. You're living this never-ending rat race of acquiring more and more fame, sex, money, and success. And while some of that is good, it becomes a problem because your life then becomes hollow. Your life is not about anything deeply meaningful or spiritual. At stage orange, you've de-spirited your life and reality. You've demystified everything to death to the point where now life is purely utilitarian. And even though you might think that's a good thing, it actually comes back to bite you in the ass because your life loses meaning and depth. Which is why Jordan Peterson talks a lot about values and meaning and depth and a spiritual component to life, because what he's really hearkening back to is that old-timey traditional stage blue. And what he wants to tell the orange and green people is that, look, you guys are overlooking something. It's not as simple as that our ancestors lived with these original religious ideas for thousands of years because they were idiots and just superstitious and unscientific and irrational. There was some of that. There was plenty of that. But also there were deep truths contained within these religious traditions that gave meaning and purpose to life beyond merely material existence. And if you ignore that, that will create a dysfunctional life and a dysfunctional society. It will lead to things like the breakdown of the family unit. It will lead to sort of hollow political activity that isn't grounded in anything deeper. And it will just leave you like a leaf blowing in the wind, going back and forth, not knowing which way to go, not being able to discipline yourself in your life and order your life towards some sort of higher vision. And see, if you're someone who didn't have that in their life, and Jordan Peterson comes along and tells you about this, for you, that's a big aha moment. You say, aha, that's what I've been missing. I grew up in this stage green culture and this stage orange culture. I didn't even really know or think deeply about stage blue or that it was valuable or important. And I've been just floating around. I haven't been able to make anything in my life. And then because of this, I was depressed and anxious and nihilistic. And I wasn't able to have proper intimate relationships. And I wasn't able to build a proper career and these sorts of things. And now that Jordan Peterson has shared these insights with me, now I can move in some direction. And that's very good and very useful. So what's the problem? Well, there are multiple problems here. We're going to have to discuss this in layers. The first problem is that even though he's teaching you these things, Jordan Peterson himself has a stage green shadow, as I would say. He himself is a very nuanced and sophisticated thinker. Unlike many progressives smear him as, he is not a racist, he's not a sexist, he's not a homophobe, he's not a transphobe, he's not a fascist, he's not a crypto-fascist, he's not a nationalist, and he's not a religious fanatic, even though he says he believes in God effectively, and he sort of comes from the Judeo-Christian worldview that he was raised into, I believe. So I would put Jordan Peterson somewhere around orange/yellow. He actually has some very sophisticated tier 2 stage yellow thinking abilities, but he can't fully go into stage yellow because he's stuck with a shadow, a very significant shadow of stage green, and that's holding him back. Obviously, he's very much mastered stage blue as well, the healthy aspects of stage blue. And that's one of the things you can admire about Jordan Peterson is that he is a good role model of healthy stage blue. He doesn't take it too far. He doesn't take stage blue into nationalism or fascism or racism or sexism or these sorts of things. If you think he does as a progressive and you disagree with me, consider the possibility that you yourself have a stage blue shadow and you're not looking at the situation objectively. You have biases that are clouding your vision. But let's wait about those biases. Let's talk about Jordan Peterson's shadow. So what is this shadow? What is a shadow? Well, he talks about shadows. The shadow is basically any aspect of consciousness or reality which you disown and deny as being part of yourself. It's something you call other to you and something you despise and hate, and you refuse to integrate into yourself. So for example, if you think Hitler is an evil monster, then Hitler is your shadow. By making him your shadow, you refuse to integrate him and to really fully understand where he was coming from. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm being very nuanced here. I'm not saying that Hitler is an angel and that there aren't serious problems with Hitler. There are very serious problems with Hitler. But if you think he's just pure evil and a monster, you've turned him into your shadow. You can turn anything in reality into your shadow. So what Jordan Peterson has done is he's turned stage green into his shadow, the social justice warrior types. And the problem fundamentally is that those of you who are following Jordan Peterson, precisely because perhaps 80 to 90% of his psychological material, non-political lectures and things, are very good psychology, and you should learn that, the other 10 to 20% is coming from his shadow. He can't really help but to exude his own the shadow comes through in his work, in his talk, in the way he carries himself, in his attitude, in his worldview. He can't help it. Nobody can. Your shadow will come through if you speak long enough. And so his shadow comes through, but most of his audience are not subtle enough to understand. They don't make these fine distinctions between stages and shadows and things. They don't understand, and so they get indoctrinated with his shadow. They get corrupted by his shadow. He kind of sneaks it in there. He's doing this unconsciously. I'm not saying he's doing this deliberately. And that's a disservice to the people following him, because then you are infected with his shadow, and that becomes your shadow. And this is especially problematic if you lean conservative, because Jordan Peterson has certain conservative leanings and biases. It's especially problematic if you lean conservative, because it's just going to reinforce his shadow against the stage green. Is just going to be reinforced. It's going to turn into a confirmation bias into your own mind, and then you're just going to buy the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker, and you yourself will get stuck at stage blue and orange and can't advance further. The point of this whole conversation is to unleash your mind from all of the obstacles so that you can get to the higher stages, beyond green to yellow and turquoise. So where does Jordan Peterson's shadow come from, and what is it exactly? Well, Jordan Peterson, you have to understand, he's fairly old, so he grew up during the Cold War era. He talks a lot about totalitarian regimes in Soviet Russia and in China, Maoism, Marxism, the old school Marxism, Soviet communism, Stalinism, and all of the evils of this. And, a common framing by conservatives is that, communism has killed 100 million people in the last century. And so he's coming from this perspective. And when you're coming from this perspective and you see college kids talking about socialism, you see he makes a conflation between the two. And he thinks that what's going on in universities today, on university campuses, with gender fluidity and gender equality and sort of anti-racism and Antifa movements and cultural Marxism, this sort of stuff, that this is just a rehash of what happened in Soviet Russia during the Red Revolution there. And this is a very big mistake. From this, he creates a shadow out of green because he misunderstands green. Anything you misunderstand about reality becomes your shadow if you don't like it. And so this is a very common conflation that's made deliberately by many conservatives, especially on Fox News, OAN, and all the talk radio, and even on YouTube, conservative YouTube. They keep making this conflation between stage green socialism or social democracy versus the old school style Venezuelan or sort of Russian, Soviet, or Maoist communism, when actually that sort of Maoist, Stalinist communism, that wasn't stage green. That was stage blue. That's the crucial mistake that conservatives make. And they make that mistake because they're paranoid. The way they frame in their mind what stage green is, they're so scared of it because they conflate it with the evils of the last century that in their mind, that justifies opposing it and demonizing it at any cost. They're not looking at it objectively. So what stage green actually is it's not the communism of old, of your granddaddy. What it is it's more like the social democracy of the northern Scandinavian countries. Yes, it could be socialism, but it doesn't even have to be socialism. The Scandinavian countries are not truly socialist. They're social democracies. They still have free markets and so on. And really, they're good places to live. The happiness index in Northern Europe is the highest in the world. The level of corruption in Northern European countries is the highest, the index for the level of corruption, which means that the higher the index is, the lower the corruption in the country, is actually higher than in the US. That means the US is more corrupt than Nordic countries. And levels of social equality and fairness are better in Nordic countries than they are in the United States. The Nordic countries are under no threat of turning into a Stalinist dictatorship. And to frame them in that way is a deep misunderstanding of human psychology, not just politics, human psychology and cultural psychology. That's the power of this spiral dynamics model that I shared with you. So, you have to be very careful about straw manning these different stages. It's very easy. It's very easy. If I wanted to straw man stage green, I could say, oh, they're all communists and they're all like Antifa and they're all going to turn violent and they're all going to go crazy and they're going to tax us to death and then that's going to lead to the destruction of America. Yeah, if you frame it that way in your mind, then yeah, it seems stupid. But that's not what stage green really is. You're misunderstanding it. See, I could also straw man stage blue. I could say that if we follow Jordan Peterson's advice of stage blue and we go back and we start to study the religious texts and so forth, we're all going to become irrational, superstitious. We're going to bring back the witch trials. We're going to start burning witches at the stake. And we're going to turn into Nazis because of nationalism. We're all going to turn racism. And then we're going to bring back slavery. See, that would be what it's like if I was very paranoid stage green and I made a shadow out of stage blue. Even though conservatives like to say that 100 million people were killed by communism, again, you have to be very careful with how your mind is cherry picking the data and the facts. Maybe that's true, but you also have to weigh it against how many people have been killed in the last century by capitalism. How many wars were started by capitalism? How many trillions of dollars have been lost? How many people have been exploited in sweatshops all around the world? How many people have had their incomes siphoned off? How many people have suffered under and died from opioid addiction, which is pushed by giant capitalistic corporations with predatory marketing and so forth? How many people have been scammed of their life savings? How many people have lost their retirement savings in Wall Street crashes and Ponzi schemes? How many democratically elected foreign governments were deposed and undermined into totalitarian dictatorships and theocracies by U.S. intelligence agencies for the purposes of advancing capitalist interests of giant multinational corporations? You see, so this idea that capitalism is innocent, it's not. Millions, many tens of millions of people have been exploited and deeply pained and even killed by capitalism. So it's not so obvious how to weigh these things properly. So my point here is not that capitalism is evil or that socialism is great. My point is that these things are much more nuanced and complex than you think, and they're more nuanced than Jordan Peterson portrays them to be, and that conservatives portray them to be, and that it's very easy to make straw men out of these different stages, so you have to be very careful. And this is not just a mistake Jordan Peterson makes, it's a mistake his followers make, it's a mistake conservatives make, it's a mistake progressives and liberals make too. Because most of the critiques of Jordan Peterson that you will find on YouTube are going to be reactionary critiques coming from stage green, which has developed a shadow out of stage blue and stage orange. And therefore, they're not able to properly understand Jordan Peterson and the value that he brings. Therefore, they discount any of his value, and that is incorrect. And that's why we're having this conversation, so that we can make these distinctions in your mind so that you have a clearer picture and you don't fall into these simplistic traps and shadows. And then you're free to move up and grow yourself more, which is ultimately what we all want. Jordan Peterson wants that. I want that. We all want that. It's just a matter of how do you do it? And it's trickier to do than most people think. So Jordan Peterson talks a lot about, for example, that stage green is bad because it wants equality of outcome. And equality of outcome is something like we need to have an equal number of men and women bricklayers. We need to have equal salaries for men and women, regardless of how hard they work or how qualified they are. And of course, that's ridiculous. But that's a straw man of stage green. That is not really what stage green wants. What stage green is about, if you really want to understand stage green, before we actually get into that, let me bring in another point that Jordan Peterson talks about a lot, which is hierarchies. He rails against stage green for wanting to level all hierarchies. And he says that there are natural hierarchies and hierarchies that are important. And he criticizes stage green for demonizing all hierarchies as being oppressive and just all about power. And he counters that by saying that the majority of hierarchies are not corrupt, they're not oppressive, they're not about power, they're about competence. So what he means is that if you go to work and you have a boss, chances are your boss is not your boss because he's some sort of power-hungry tyrant who domineered everyone in the workplace and put himself at the top and crowned himself king, but rather he got promoted from within because he was the most hardworking, the most loyal to the company, and has the most experience and takes on the most responsibility. And therefore, he's your boss because he knows more than you. He's willing to take on more responsibility than you. He's willing to work longer hours than you. And therefore, he should get paid more than you. That's only fair. That's how he would portray the situation. And that's generally true, I would say. But the way that a stage green person would counter that is by saying, yes, that's generally true, but that's only true maybe in 80% of the cases. Let's say 80% of hierarchies are actually valid and genuine, based on competence and merit, and they don't need to be destroyed. But that still leaves 20% which are corrupt. 20% in which the person holding the position of power is only holding that position not because he's the most creative or the most selfless or the best qualified, but because he's an asshole and he's entitled based upon inheriting it from his family or something like that, or just by playing manipulative political games. And honestly, there's a lot of truth to that. There is maybe 10 or 20% of people in positions of power who only got there because they are sociopaths. And sociopathy is actually a very effective strategy for gaining lots of power and wealth and sex and fame. And the epitome of this is, of course, Donald Trump. What is Donald Trump? If you look at him objectively, he is not qualified to do almost anything. The only thing he's good at is spin, bullshit, and con artistry. That's his skill. But that is not a legitimate skill. That's a corrupting skill. He's not actually competent at anything he does. Every single one of his businesses fails. Including his presidency, he's not competent at governing. He's not competent at managing people. He's not competent at hiring people. He's not competent at finding loyal people. who have a high integrity because he has none himself. And so because of this, and yet in our society, the way our society is structured, he was still able to rise so high and achieve so much and get hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, I mean, he inherited $450 million from his daddy. Is that truly competence? That's what the progressives would say. And here Jordan Peterson has a problem because he doesn't sufficiently acknowledge that a significant percentage, maybe up to 20% or even more, of our hierarchies and our social systems are corrupt in this way, and that this hurts a lot of people down below. Jordan Peterson portrays it as Stage Green wants to destroy all hierarchies. And maybe a few radical and dumb Stage Green people do want that, but the majority of Stage Green people do not want that. If you look at the way that the Scandinavian countries are structured, there's still plenty of hierarchy. You're not getting rid of hierarchy anytime soon. That's not something you need to be paranoid about. But we do want to level some of the bad, corrupt parts of hierarchies. We did that in the past. For example, there used to exist monarchies. Now they're almost all gone. What happened? Well, we recognized that that was a corrupt hierarchy. It was oppressing lots of people, hurting lots of people, and we rebelled against it collectively as a society, and we said no. And today we're happier for it, right? Do you want to live under a monarchy? Do you have a problem with a monarchy? Then you got a problem with hierarchy. And this isn't just about government. It's also about institutions. It's also about academia. A lot of academia is corrupt. Like the professors and the administrators of many universities, they're not there because they're the most intelligent and competent people. They're there because they're the best at bringing in business, at doing marketing, at using shady manipulative tactics through corruption, through just family lineage, through their wealth that they inherited, through the last name that they have. A lot of the Ivy League schools are all about that. It's all about this sort of legacy model. It's not about truly which students are the most intelligent. It's really like getting into Harvard. You'll have a better chance getting into Harvard, not if you're more intelligent, but rather if your daddy went to Harvard. That's how it works. And if he can give them $1 million donation, that's how it works. So is that a competence hierarchy? No. Fuck no. That's really corrupt and it's not healthy for our society. That's what Stage Green is concerned about. And Stage Green is also concerned about the influence of materialism in our culture, especially money in politics, the way money corrupts everything, the way that you can just buy anything you want with money, including power, and crush people underneath you. See, Stage Green, to understand it, you have to radically expand your sense of empathy and compassion for other people and even animals, for that matter, which is why veganism is very prominent at Stage Green. Because you expand your compassion, you start to empathize with the suffering of others, the suffering of the poor, the downtrodden, the marginalized, the minorities, the third world countries. You start to care about these things. You want to help all of these people and beings. And so you become more open. And you become more sensitive to how the capitalist system is rigging the game in such a way that it becomes very difficult to succeed or advance yourself as an individual. For example, a Stage Green person looks at the healthcare system in America, sees tens of thousands of people dying unnecessarily, not because they can't afford healthcare, but because our healthcare costs are so much more than they need to be compared to other countries like in Europe. Like our prescription drug costs, a drug that costs in Europe $10 might cost $1,000 in the US. And the only reason that is because of the healthcare cartel or mafia that has been entrenched and established in America, purely for profit. Now, we ask ourselves, is that a healthy way to structure society? Is that a fair way to structure society where just because some giant multinational pharmaceutical company has billions of dollars in the bank. It can exploit, it can buy politicians, bribe them to change the laws, change the tax system such that everything advantages that company. That company becomes a giant monopoly, buys up all the smaller companies, jacks up the prices on all the drugs, and then your mother, who has cancer, can't even afford to pay for her cancer medication, and then she dies. Is that a society you want to live in? Of course, the answer is no. Do you want to live in a society where, for example, a giant chemical company has so much wealth and has monopolized so much of the market? It has so much power that it can buy its own senators. It can pay those senators to deregulate chemical regulations. It's then allowed to dump metric tons of mercury and lead and arsenic from its chemical production facilities directly into streams and lakes and ponds and oceans, from which your fish and your food and your water comes from. And then your kids drink the water supply into which was dumped arsenic and radioactive materials. Upstream, they dumped it, and then it went downstream into your water supply. And then your children drink this, and then your child develops a mental disorder like ADHD or autism or some sort of retardation or autoimmune conditions and disorders or cancer. And then your child has to live with that, and then you have to care for that child for the rest of your life. Is that a society you want to live in? The answer is obviously no. But the problem with Jordan Peterson's politics and with conservative politics is that they don't acknowledge this problem. Because in their worldview, everyone should be just responsible for themselves. This is the sort of libertarian worldview. It's the idea that, well, we're all just individuals, man. I'm going to do what's good for me, and you do what's good for you, and then everything will be fine. But it won't be fine. Because if I'm just an individual and I'm just behaving selfishly as though I'm not part of a community of 8 billion people, then I can amass billions of dollars and I can dump radioactive material and poison into your water supply, and you won't be able to do anything about it because you're just an average person. You can't sue me. I've got 100 lawyers that I can afford. You can't even afford one. And what good is suing me going to do once your kid already has cancer and dies? Are you going to get satisfaction from winning a suit against me? And even if you do, I'll pay you $50 million. But you know how much I earned from dumping that poison into the water supply? I earned $1 billion. So to me, to pay you 50 to get $1 billion, no problem. That's effectively what libertarianism leads to. So what Stage Green wants, if we're going to steel man Stage Green, what Stage Green wants is it wants a more fair society. It does not want equality of outcome. What it wants is actually, it wants equality of opportunity. So Jordan Peterson here misunderstands and mischaracterizes Stage Green because he doesn't integrate it properly. He says that Stage Green only wants equality of outcome. No. What Stage Green is doing is Stage Green is looking at equality of outcome in order to judge whether there is truly equality of opportunity. You see, because how do you measure whether equality of opportunity exists? How do you measure whether our society and our social system, our police system, and our military and so forth, our academic systems, how do you measure that these systems are actually fair and honest and uncorrupted? Well, one way to do it is to actually look at the outcomes. You can't completely ignore outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean that everything has to be split down the middle. That doesn't mean, in the way Jordan Peterson says, that we need to have an equal number of bricklayers, men and women. That's a ridiculous straw man. No reasonable, intelligent Stage Green person is asking for that. If they are, they're being stupid. But they aren't asking for that. What they're asking for is a redress of the corruptions of the past. It was true that there was slavery in the past. It's still true that even though slavery is gone and official segregation is gone, there are still racial problems within these various systems. We can debate about to what degree it exists there and what kind of remedies need to be taken to correct it. But the stage green person generally errs on the side of giving benefit of the doubt to the marginalized and to the downtrodden. The stage green person wants to rectify some of the inequities of the past. The conservative stage blue and orange person says, nah, we don't need to do that. That's stupid. And the reason they feel that way is because they lack the empathy that comes online at stage green. See, if you had a child who was gay or trans or had cancer or was poisoned by a pharmaceutical company or was addicted to opioids because of the predatory marketing that these giant companies like Purdue Pharma did. Now they're out of business. If that happened to you, you would suddenly develop a lot of empathy. But if you live a comfy life with a decent amount of money, where you're not bothered by these things haven't personally touched you yet, then you can act as though these things are not important. So hierarchies are not bad. We will not be flattening all of them. That's not going to happen. Stop fear-mongering about that. But some hierarchies do need to be questioned because they are oppressive. Is everything oppressive? No. The majority of things are not oppressive in society. But some things are, and those things are worthwhile to question and to change. And that's what progressives ultimately want. See, when you see it in this light, all of a sudden progressivism and social democracy doesn't seem so radical. So the problem is when you start to portray people like Bernie Sanders and AOC as though they are Antifa thugs who want to take over the country through a revolution, Maoist style, and then execute all the capitalists and then put in a totalitarian regime. I think that Jordan Peterson honestly has that kind of fantasy in his mind about what the excesses of stage green are. And that is precisely incorrect. And I think the danger is that if you watch too much of his political talk, he will sneak that sort of paranoia into your mind. One of the mistakes that Jordan Peterson makes is that because he worked his whole life in this stage green bubble of academia, he was overly exposed to the excesses of stage green through academia, and he overestimates how much of that is a problem globally and specifically even in Canada or in America. The majority of the world is below stage blue in their development, stage blue or below. And the majority, even in America, is stage orange, stage blue. It's not even at green yet. So the idea that green is the dangerous stage, this is a misguided idea. Yes, there can be dangers to green. I'm not dismissing that. Yes, sometimes green can even be violent. For example, with Antifa, sometimes they'll throw a brick through a window. Sometimes they maybe even kill somebody. But you have to understand that every stage kills people. And in general, the higher your stage, the less people you kill. So if we're going to be comparing numbers of how many people killed who, then and the dangers based upon that, then I could easily make a straw man out of stage blue. And I could say, well, the things that Jordan Peterson is teaching is going to lead to white nationalism and fascism. And it's going to lead to many people getting killed. And that is actually the greater danger. The danger, Jordan Peterson misunderstands the danger. The danger is not that we're going to go too hog wild on stage green and then totalitarianism will be installed in America. The danger is actually that we're not going to go green fast enough and that many people will suffer and die needlessly from that. And also that there's going to be a backlash from stage blue, and that if you enable stage blue too much, that actually turns into what we see with Trumpism and the kind of stuff with the riots of the Capitol, the insurrection at the Capitol. Now, if you're conservative, you'll say, oh, Leo, but what about Antifa? Yeah, Antifa is creating problems for stage green, and I wish it didn't exist because it makes stage green way too easy to demonize and to strawman. If Antifa didn't exist, that image problem would be gone. But it does exist. So there are excesses. But the excesses of Antifa pale in comparison to the excesses of stage orange and stage blue. A lot more people die at stage orange and blue than at stage green. This is what's being missed. Also, what's being missed is that every stage comes in a certain sequence and you cannot skip stages. And you must go through all the stages if you want to get to the higher stages. And that this entire process is inevitable. Therefore, this idea that if America right now is center of gravity orange, leaning a little bit green, already evolved out of stage blue, what does that mean based on this model? It means that in the next 50 years, the country is moving in this direction. So what you need to come to accept as a conservative is that no matter how much you whine and bitch and moan and kick and scream, no matter what excuses you make, no matter how you vote, no matter how much you resist, you can even start a civil war if you want. But none of that will prevent the country from moving towards green over the next 50 years. It's going to happen. You can't change that. You can only resist it and slow it down. And if you do, you're going to create more suffering and more people will die and be harmed as a result of that. We are facing genuine and real problems in the world that cannot be solved at stage orange. The limitations of orange are becoming abundantly clear with climate change, with pollution, with giant corporate monopolies, with Wall Street, with crashes of the economy. These things are not sustainable, and this will not persist into the future. Society must find solutions beyond that. If you can't see and acknowledge that, you're stuck. And this is a big problem with Jordan Peterson's politics and with some of his fans who follow him for that reason. Now, not all of his fans follow him for the political stuff. I think a lot of his fans just like him for the psychology stuff. They might not even know his political opinions very much if they only watch his psychology lectures. I've personally met people like that who don't even know Jordan Peterson's politics. The problem is that if you keep listening to him long enough, you will eventually imbibe his politics. You'll absorb it through osmosis without even consciously realizing what happened. Because he rails against stage green quite a bit. He sneaks it into almost all of his talks in one form or another. Whether he's talking about equality of opportunity or hierarchies or lobsters or whatever, he sneaks it in there. Or he talks about feminism or he talks about gender fluidity and he sneaks it in there. So what's not being acknowledged is that if we're at stage orange, the next stage is green, and we have not realized or actualized green yet. So this idea that, well, I don't like green, therefore let's just skip green to yellow. It's not going to fly. That means you created a shadow that's going to create dysfunction, suffering, death, and evil if you do that. Instead, what needs to happen is you need to recognize that you have certain biases and prejudices, you have certain fears of stage green, you need to set those aside, you need to work on really understanding green, integrate it, and then we can move on to yellow. But that's not going to happen collectively for another 100 years. We've been facing over the last 10 or 20 years as society is starting to inch towards green. We've been encountering so much backlash and resistance from stage blue and orange. That's effectively what happened, for example, with the whole MAGA movement, all the alt-right movements. And we have many movements around the world now towards authoritarianism. Why is that? Because as the whole world is shifting more and more towards green, people are scared of it. They don't understand it. The media is fear-mongering to them about it, and therefore the way they vote is they vote regressively. And then this leads to some of these sorts of regressive nationalistic movements we see around the world. We see it in Russia. We see it in Germany. We see some of it in Poland, in Brazil, in China, and elsewhere. This is not only an American problem. Now, am I really worried that we're going to go into fascism? No. not in the developed world. In America, in Canada, and so forth, there's never going to be fascism. It's not a legitimate concern because what you have to understand is that human psyches are all evolving together. It's not a legitimate concern that we're going to go back to Soviet communism because we've already exhausted that and seen its limitations and grown beyond it. The socialism of today, what conservatives call socialism, is really more like social democracy. It's more like Scandinavia. And Scandinavia is a pretty good place to live. Now, it's got its problems. I'm not saying it doesn't have its excesses. You can cite me some articles and examples of excesses in Scandinavia. Sure. But I can cite you a lot more of the excesses of stage orange in America. And if you were the average person, you would rather live in Scandinavia than you would in America. See, America is really great to live in if you are like in the top 5%. Then it's awesome. You're so free just to do anything. You can buy politicians, you can buy corporate jets, you pay low taxes, you can avoid taxes, you can do tax shelters, you can do capital gains, and like it's a wonderland for the rich. But if you're not in that top 5%, then it's not so great. So if you were randomly rolling the dice, like before you were born, you're going to choose where to incarnate. Should I incarnate into America or into Scandinavia? You would be stupid to pick America, because the chances that you're going to roll that dice, you're not going to get snake eyes, you're going to get something else, and you're not going to be in the top 5%. And in that case, better to live in Scandinavia. So this is something to keep in mind. Now, see, the reason that the country will inevitably move towards green is because orange is unsustainable. What we're doing with CO2 emissions, what we're doing with the markets, the wealth gap inequality that's happening between the rich and the poor, all of these things are unsustainable. They can only continue maybe for another 30 years. Maybe for the next 30 years, we can still keep pushing orange, but the more we push it, the more it's going to break down. And eventually it will become so unsustainable that everyone will start to acknowledge that we got to go green. And it's already happening. But there's also backlash, because many people don't understand what's really going on. They're clueless about this model. They're scared. People in the media are feeding them paranoia and these fantasies of evil socialism and communism from the Cold War era. These are biases and holdovers from the Cold War era. And this is making people so confused that they don't know how to vote properly or think properly about these issues. So, green is going to happen. The only question is, will you resist it or not? Why resist? Why not open yourself to it? Understand it? And then whatever limits and problems there are, we'll deal with them. Why don't you trust that we can deal with them? Why are you paranoid about it? That would be my question, Jordan Peterson. Why do you have so little faith in mankind? And of course, he would say, well, because 100 million people were killed in the last century. Yeah, exactly. 100 million people were killed in the last century based on stage blue and orange. And actually way more were killed because we didn't even count orange fully into that stage. Don't be so preoccupied about the boogeyman of green that you overlook the evils of the current system. The current system truly does have plenty of evils in it. Now, here's another problem with Jordan Peterson's take on things, is that he talks a lot about individualism versus collectivism, and he frames it as though collectivism is dangerous, whereas individualism is the most important one. And this is a very deep misunderstanding of this dynamic, of this duality. And I want to help you to correct that misunderstanding. So today, conservatives generally lean more towards the individualistic, sort of libertarian worldview, where they think that, well, don't blame society for your problems. You're just being lazy. Take responsibility. Get disciplined. Clean your room. Get your house in order. Bootstrap yourself. Make something of yourself. Earn the money. And then you'll have it. And stop whining and complaining. That's the sort of conservative worldview. It's about taking personal responsibility for things. Now, the collectivist, more green worldview is more like, we're not just individuals. We're a society. We're a community. And not just as in America or as Canada or as Europe, but as the world. When one country pollutes the oceans, it pollutes the oceans for everybody. When Japan dumps radioactive waste from Fukushima into the ocean, it goes everywhere in the ocean, not just around Japan. Everything is interconnected. We're living in a globalized world with internet, where cultures are all intermingling, where people are speaking different languages to each other just like never before, where you can call a friend in Africa from America in seconds and it costs you nothing, where the internet has interconnected everything, where cheap air travel around the world is easy and fast and convenient, where viruses travel from one country to the next and know no borders. In this kind of world, you have to acknowledge that we are a collective. We are not just individuals. If you treat the world as though everyone is just an individual, a little atom, you are missing the crucial emergent properties that result from social networks. And I'm not just talking about the internet. I'm talking about the entire planet. Our economies are not distinct economies. They're all interconnected together. And so this libertarian fantasy, this conservative fantasy that I'm just an individual, and as long as I get my own house in order, then everything else will be okay, as Jordan Peterson tends to feed you that idea, there is some truth to that. It is very important to work on your own life, and that's what I teach the most. I teach so much about turning inwards and taking responsibility for your life. I teach all these things because, of course, they're extremely important. But what I also recognize is that it's not about individual versus collective. It's both. It's the yin-yang relationship. The two serve each other. Here is why. Here's the example that will explain this for you. Let's say I'm struggling in school. I'm like 18 years old. I'm struggling in school to make something of myself, to succeed, to get good grades, to get into a good university. I'm struggling with that. I have maybe ADHD. I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I'm having these problems. I come to Jordan Peterson and he says, put your life in order, mister. You got to clean your room. You got to get disciplined. You got to maybe start going to church. You got to read some books, and you got to watch some of my lectures, and you got to find some meaning in your life, and stop wasting your time worrying about these collective issues about capitalism and socialism and racism and gender rights or corporate greed and predatory capitalism. Stop worried about this stuff because that's not your problem. You can worry about that after you fix yourself. Okay, that sounds good in theory. But what if the reason I'm having problems is because I have ADHD, I can't focus, I can't meditate, I can't even sit down to read a book for 10 minutes because my mind is just going crazy. And the reason that is because of the lead and the mercury in the water that I've been drinking in my public water supply for my entire life, for 18 years. Is that something I can fix? Is that an individual problem or is that a collective problem? And are we just supposed to allow that to keep happening and be quiet about it? I'm just supposed to ignore that? No, that's a systemic collective problem. And if you think that this is some exaggerated example, it's not at all. Autism, ADHD, depression, even criminality, autoimmune disorders, these are all directly linked to heavy metals that you consume in your food and in your water. Where do these heavy metals come from? They come from a lack of regulations for giant corporations and pollution. In the 1970s or so, before regulation was passed by the US government, all gasoline was leaded gasoline. Today, when you go to the gas station, you see it says unleaded gasoline everywhere. Why does it say unleaded? Because you can't have leaded gasoline anymore. Why not? Because regulation was passed in the 1970s or so. I don't remember the exact date, roughly that time, because research was done which found that there's a direct correlation between the amount of lead in a child's brain tissue and his propensity to become a criminal later in life. The correlation is so strong that it's like a factor of 10 or 20. That means that if you have a certain level of lead or mercury in your brain, your propensity to become a criminal, a violent criminal, is going to increase by 20 times. Think about that. Think about how significant that is. Is that a problem you can solve as an individual, as a kid, as a teenager? No. This is a problem that's happening to you. You're not even aware that it's happening to you. Maybe this is the first time in your life you're hearing about it, and it's already been happening to you for the last 10, 20 years. You're just hearing it from me. This is just one example. There are hundreds of examples like this. Another example might be that, let's say you're trying to bootstrap yourself in life, you're working hard and so forth, but you're not even able to find affordable housing. You're not able to buy a house, you're not even able to rent a house because in your area, all of the real estate has been bought up by wealthy hedge funds who are just looking to speculate it and make profit off of real estate such that the rent is sky high. You can't afford it. And then you're forced to move to a worse part of the country, to a cheaper part of the country, or maybe even go homeless. Is this your own personal problem? Well, to a certain extent, you are responsible for keeping a job and paying rent and so forth. So it is a personal problem. Maybe if you worked a little smarter and harder, you would be able to pay your rent. But even if you did that, you would still be getting screwed and exploited and predated upon by these giant capitalistic hedge funds because these billionaires acquire so much money that then they want to invest that money to earn even more money. And this keeps widening the wealth gap in the country, eroding the middle class. This is not good for the country. It's not good for real estate prices. It's not good in many different ways. And then on top of that, these rich people, they avoid paying any tax upon these profits because they just funnel it into various offshore accounts. So acknowledge that these are serious, legitimate problems and that individualism and collectivism, they fit together like yin and yang, black and white. You need them both. And the way that these spiral stages work is that they alternate between individualist and collective stages. So, for example, stage red is individualist, stage blue is collectivist, stage orange is individualist again, stage green is collectivist, and stage yellow is individualist again. So don't get stuck on any one. You're going to be jumping between them as you grow and develop yourself in your life. You can't just say that because collectivism was tried back in Soviet Russia or Maoist China, that collectivism is now evil. This is a preposterous straw man and a deep misunderstanding of human and cultural psychology. Jordan Peterson does make some valid points about, for example, problems with gender fluidity and the breaking down of certain traditional structures. For example, he would say that it's a problem when you start playing with gender identities because it can make you confused and then it can break down the family unit such that it's hard to raise children. It's hard to even keep a marriage because it's hard for you to even, like, that traditional role of male and female, which is very strong in stage blue. That starts to break down as we evolve. And it starts to create maybe problems. People are confused about their sexuality or they're sexually dysfunctional. They don't have sex as often or as soon. as they should. They don't have children. That creates problems, perhaps, because family and children and a marriage actually is a deep source of fulfillment in most people's lives. And if you're missing that component, you're missing out on an important part of life, he would say. And that's generally correct. Even though you can play with gender identities and come up with new ones and such things, the problem is that that's not necessarily going to be very functional. And it may not even make you fulfilled as you think. Exercising freedom willy-nilly does not in and of itself make you fulfilled. And it might actually start to erode important building blocks of society, which is the family. A cohesive family is important. When you don't have a solid family structure, then every individual that's born is sort of born crippled and dysfunctional. But even though that's true, the reality is that family, that sort of classical traditional family unit of your grandparents and maybe your parents, it didn't just break down simply because of Stage Green. It broke down because of its own inherent limitations. It started breaking down maybe in the 1960s. People became more sexually promiscuous. Homosexuality was more acceptable. People started experimenting, partying, drinking, doing drugs, having more sex, because part of Stage Blue is a repression of sex. It represses the sexual instinct, tries to control it very rigidly. That has its pros, it has its cons. You can't keep a thing repressed forever. So eventually, Pandora's box was opened. With Stage Orange, sex became this material thing, whereas in Stage Blue, sex was more of a sort of a traditional family thing. And in fact, the best example of Stage Blue people is that these are people who believe that you should not have sex with anyone unless you're married to them. Stage Orange says, oh, fuck all that, that's stupid. I'm gonna have sex with as many people as I want. The more the better. Stage Green is also very open with sex, and it starts to experiment with different kinds of sex and so forth. But the problem is that was going to happen anyway. You can't just constrain the old traditions and keep them in place forever. It was going to break apart anyways. So what I would say to counter Jordan Peterson is I would say, again, don't get too paranoid. We will figure out new structures for how to raise kids, how to maintain families. It's not going away. Mankind is not going to stop having sex anytime soon, and it's not going to stop having babies anytime soon. And yes, there will be a period of adjustment where we're not sure, maybe how to do it as well as our ancestors did it or whatever. But there was also benefits because we're not as sexually repressed as we were in the Victorian era. Like I heard stories in the Victorian era where a woman would have some sort of gynecological problem, like a cancer or something, and or a pain. And ordinarily, like today, she would just go to a doctor, to a gynecologist, and she would get it fixed. But she couldn't do that in the Victorian era because all doctors back then were men; they weren't women. You can't have a woman doctor back then, and it's part of the patriarchy. So that was that. But then also you say, well, so what? Well, so what? People were so sexually repressed back then, especially women. They were supposed to be ladies, proper ladies, that she couldn't go to a male doctor and open her legs to her. And in fact, there was a quote that I read where the doctor said, come on over, I'll take a look. And the woman, said, I'm a proper lady. I would rather die before, I show my privates to you. See, that's a real problem. That's Stage Blue. Gone too far, too restrictive, too unreasonable. So now you understand the shadow. Now you understand a little bit more about the political stuff. In general, what I would say is that Jordan Peterson makes good points, but oftentimes he over-exaggerates them and he puts that fear into it. And that's in general the problem with the conservative mindset is that it's too fearful. It's too paranoid. It's too closed to new ideas. It's too attached to the old traditions. And that's part of the reason for that is because there's actually differences between the conservative brain and the liberal brain. The conservative brain is more wired towards fear. It's more closed. Jordan Peterson himself talks about this. And that's correct. There's truth to that. Now, does that mean that all fear is legitimate? No, some fear is legitimate. But be careful not to turn it into paranoia. All right, now it's time to get into the real juice of this conversation. That was all the political stuff. That's not what's most important. Now, this is what's really, really most important. And it is how to get you from green and even higher. And this now goes to, we're setting aside all the political stuff, and we're going to be just talking about the psychology and the philosophy and the epistemology and the metaphysics of Jordan Peterson's teachings and what is lacking there. There's so much to say, it's hard to know where to begin. So, a big thing that Jordan Peterson talks about is values. He talks about the importance of meaning in life. And he frames it as a hierarchy. And he talks about God. When asked, does he believe in God? He says, well, I act as though God were real, which is a complex and clever way of saying that he does. But you see, Jordan Peterson is sort of stuck in a bind. The bind is that, on the one hand, he deeply intuits that there's something more to life and to reality than just pure materialism. He intuits that, and it's obvious to me. There is a spiritual dimension to life. He knows it. He knows it's very important. He's trying to guide his audience to that realization, but he himself does not know how to put his finger on it and how to explicitly tell you what it is. He alludes to it. And that's why he uses a lot of references from movies and old Pinocchio cartoons and myths and allegories from the past, from the Bible and from elsewhere. Because his argument is that basically what you need in life is you need an overarching hierarchy that gives structure and meaning to your whole existence. And for that, you need some sort of top value at your hierarchy. He would say that traditionally, in traditional cultures, that top value was God. But the problem Jordan Peterson has is that even though intuitively he thinks God exists, he can't really say that God exists because he has this identity and career he's built up as a scientist, professor, academic, public intellectual. And it has gone out of vogue to say that God exists in intellectual circles, in universities, as an academic. Because if you say that, they're going to ask you, well, where's your proof? And if you say, well, I don't have any proof, it's just a gut feeling, they're going to laugh at you and say that, oh, you're one of those superstitious, irrational people, and they're going to kick you out. And you're going to lose all credibility professionally as an academic. So he can't come out and say that. And he also values science, too. He's not just doing it for show. He also values the methods of science. He believes in evolution, evolutionary biology. He uses this for his arguments and so forth. So his challenge personally that he's struggling with is he's struggling, how do I integrate the gut feeling I have that God is important and it might even be real, but I don't know what it is. I don't know how to prove it. Versus science is real and rationality is true and that's important too. How do you reconcile these two things? He can't quite tell you, and he himself doesn't know. Because actually, he's gotten himself stuck with the stage green shadow. So here, let's really dive deep. Are you ready for this? One of the biggest things that has him stuck with stage green and the shadow is that stage green, this is what he talks about as postmodernism. Most of the people who listen to him have no idea what postmodernism is. It's a very complex and nuanced topic. I actually have episodes about Jacques Derrida, postmodernism, deconstruction, and non-duality. You can go check that out. But anyways, the summary of it is this, is that The difference between modernism versus postmodernism is that modernism had a sort of objective view of reality. There's an objective way that things are. There are men, there are women, there are atoms and molecules, chairs and tables in the world. Things are how they seem and how we think of them. That's roughly the modernist view, and we can think about them rationally. And there's good things in the world and there's bad things in the world. Then the postmodernists came along and started questioning all that and said, wait a minute, maybe these are arbitrary biases that we have. Maybe this stuff isn't actually absolutely true, but it's subjective. Maybe it's relative. Maybe if you're living in the Middle East, your culture is the best for you, relatively speaking. And if you're living in America, your culture is the best for you, relatively speaking. But then if you're living in Japan or China, American culture is not the best for you. And that's not because any one of these people is wrong or deluded. It's simply because they have different points of view. And likewise, for example, if you believe that there are only men and only women, and this is a physical, biological fact, well, that might be true for you because that's what you believe. Whereas if you believe that gender is fluid and you can change these things around and that these are not biological facts, that's what's true for you because it's relative. Now, the modernists would say, no. What are you talking about? It's not relative. These are biological facts. There's X, Y chromosomes, and it just is what it is. It's baked into your DNA. And likewise, a modernist would say, there's black people, there's white people. It's crystal clear. Everybody knows the difference. What's the problem? The problem is that these rigid categories that you create, eventually they all start to collapse because actually they're not grounded in anything objectively true. Because actually, relativity is at play within reality. Reality is a relativistic system at many levels. And there is something called social construction, where we construct various illusions, such as money, in order to help mankind do what it does. We even construct things like the border around the country. What is a country? A country is a social construction. There's no such thing as America. We constructed it in our minds. And so the postmodernists take this very far and they try to relativize everything. So Jordan Peterson has an instinctive reaction against this. And many conservatives do. They're frightened by the implications of total relativism. Relativism run amok. And so part of Jordan Peterson's biggest critique of Stage Green is that you can't just relativize everything. If you relativize everything, everything loses meaning and value. And then you're lost and you don't know what to do. And then you fall into a sort of nihilism and depression. And then you can't build a good life. Therefore, Jordan Peterson would say that you need to construct some sort of hierarchy for your life of value and meaning so that you know what to do, what your priorities are. And you gotta pick one of these values to put at the top of your pyramid of priorities. And that value could be God in the literal sense, or it could be God in the poetic or metaphorical sense, where, for example, if you're a Wall Street executive and all you care about is money, Jordan Peterson would say, that means money and success is your God. And if you're a scientist that is hyper-rational and quantitative, and science is your purpose in life, then he would say science or mathematics is your God. Rationality is your God. Or if what's most important to you is taking care of your family and raising children, he would say family is your highest value, family is your God, and so on. And so he would say, pick one of these things and then orient your life towards that. Now, he tells you God is the highest value, but he doesn't tell you why. Because he himself doesn't know. And the way he frames it is in this sort of mythological, poetic, allegorical sense, where he says that, well, probably the Bible and many of these myths and stories from the past, they're not literally true. They're not true in the scientific sense, because he can't say that the Bible is scientifically true because he's a scientific person. But also, he doesn't want to give up the Bible completely. So he's trying to hedge his bets here, which is a tricky a tightrope walk to navigate. But he manages to do it somehow. And so the way he does it is by saying that, well, these are stories that contain lessons from our ancestors that are valuable, that have been discovered over centuries and millennia. And that what religion is really about is, it's not about some literal story being true scientifically. It's about just wisdom, psychological wisdom that is important to kind of ground your psyche and give you direction, meaning in life. That's what it's about. And the danger of stage green relativism and postmodernism is that it breaks all of that down and it makes you believe as though, like, well, anything goes. I'm free to do anything. I'm free to be a man. I'm free to be a woman. I'm free to cut my dick off. I'm free to dye my hair purple. I'm free to change my race. I'm free to get surgery. I'm free to jump off a cliff. Like, I'm free to do anything, and it doesn't matter what I do. And he would say, but it does matter what you do, because if you jump off a cliff, you're not going to be happy. Some things make you happy, some things don't. And religion tells you which things make you happy and which ones don't, as it was discovered by our ancestors for thousands of years. So wouldn't it be wise of you to follow that religious stuff? And so now you might say, well, Leo, that sounds pretty good. That sounds pretty smart. So what's wrong with that? So isn't relativism dangerous and a problem? Doesn't it lead to nihilism and inaction? It can. But again, everything can be taken to its extremes. Everything can be misused. Everything can become unhealthy when it's out of proportion. So healthiness depends on proportion, not really the thing itself per se. So, if you drink too much water, you're going to die. That doesn't mean water is bad. It just means you got to know how much water to drink and when to stop. So here's the thing. Now we get to the real crux of the situation. This is what Jordan Peterson really doesn't understand about God and about values and about meaning. This is the thing he's resisting. This is his biggest shadow. And if he could get over this, he could really become an amazing teacher. The problem is that Jordan Peterson has a fundamental misunderstanding of what religion is and where it came from and why it exists. Religion is not a collection just of parables and allegories and myths with some sort of practical way of adding a little bit of meaning to your life. It's way deeper than that. Religion, its ultimate source, is the insights of the most advanced mystics that have lived throughout human history. These mystics were able to reach radical, expanded states of consciousness, superhuman states of consciousness, from which they became conscious of the ultimate absolute truth of what reality truly is, of what consciousness is. And then, once they accessed these truths, they shared them with mankind and suggested that mankind try to pursue these truths for themselves. But because mankind, the majority of mankind, was ignorant and delusional and too selfish, the truths were misunderstood and misinterpreted and turned into dogma and ideology and myths and stories. Because the actual states of consciousness cannot be communicated, nor can they be scientifically proven, nor can they be turned into any kind of scientific algorithms for how to access them. And they can be only accessed by very exceptional, hardcore individuals who are willing to question reality very deeply to levels that would threaten most other humans. How do I know this? Because I've actually done it. I've reached those levels of consciousness that are written about in the Bible, in Buddhism, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Jainism, in Judaism. All of these religions and spiritual traditions talk about the same ultimate truths, which is otherwise known as God, Allah, Buddha mind, Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it. So here's how it really works. you start thinking deeply about the nature of reality, and you start questioning it philosophically. You start questioning epistemology and metaphysics. You start questioning what reality is. You start questioning what you are and what your mind is. And you start to deconstruct everything you've learned from your culture. You deconstruct religion. You deconstruct schooling. You deconstruct political ideology. You deconstruct science. You deconstruct all your economic ideas. You deconstruct everything and you remove your mind. You free your mind of all attachments and all biases. Because you want to really get to the truth of things. You stop believing in anything, including beliefs in science and other things. And you delve deeper and deeper and deeper into the relativity of reality. You start to recognize that all culture, all cultural norms, all languages, all scientific systems, all models, all maps, all books, everything I've learned, it's all relative. It's not absolutely true. And then you start wondering to yourself, well, what is absolutely true? And you go deeper and deeper and deeper in that. You start questioning yourself with a deep, profound, corrosive skepticism, which takes over your entire mind. This is not just something you do on your spare time. This consumes you. It drives you mad. It drives you into nihilism and solipsism and skepticism and cynicism. And it's very difficult psychologically on you. It's very threatening. Because all of your attachments, even things like the idea that you should have a family or that family is even good, you question that. The idea that money is important, you question that. You even question the idea whether life itself is important. And you surrender your attachment to life itself. And if you continue down this process, all the way down, and you deconstruct your entire mind and psyche, what happens is that you go beyond psychology and you go into metaphysics and you go into pure consciousness. And then what you become conscious of is that your ego mind and your entire identity as a self completely collapses as though it never even existed. Your self-image of you as a biological human, it collapses. The colors and sounds and things still stay the same. Your body still stays here. But your self-image, your psychological psyche, self-image, it all collapses into nothing. And with that collapses the idea of a physical objective reality. And when this happens, it feels like you've gone insane because there's no more difference between sanity and insanity, good and bad, right and wrong. Everything collapses into pure relativity. And when that happens, it's the most counterintuitive and astounding thing. Because you would think, well, Leo, what you're describing here sounds like the height of madness and the worst possible thing that anyone could wish on themselves. Why would anyone do this? Why not just live a normal, good life? But you don't appreciate what happens when you lose yourself. When you lose yourself, when you lose your mind, when you lose any notion of an objective external reality. And what I'm describing here is something that Jesus did, that the Buddha did, that happened to Muhammad, that all the great mystics of the past have done. When all of that collapses, your mind collapses, what are you left with? You're left with consciousness. Nothing but consciousness. All that exists is consciousness. This is consciousness. The material world that you thought was solid and real, it was always just consciousness. Infinite consciousness. Absolute consciousness. This consciousness is the absolute truth. It's not a belief. It's not an ideology. It's not wishful thinking. It's not something you program your mind with. This is the result of removing all programming from the mind, destroying the mind entirely, transcending the mind entirely. And so a very twisted, paradoxical thing happens is that even though you go deeper and deeper into relativity, and as you're doing this, all meaning and value is lost. And here is where Jordan Peterson's shadow comes in, is that he's not open to this process. He's not open to deconstruction because what he's worried about is losing value and meaning. He thinks you need that to live a good life. But here's what he doesn't understand is that if you go all the way down this rabbit hole and you lose all meaning and all value, what happens is that literally all meaning and value collapses. The difference between good and bad collapses and it disappears. And then what happens? You're not left with neutrality. You would think maybe, oh, it's just neutrality. No, what you're left with is you're left with God consciousness. You're left with absolute good. You're left with infinite love. You would say, infinite love, that makes no sense. Why would absolute relativity and the collapse of all values and meanings lead to infinite love? Well, because the logic of it is this, is that what value is, what meaning is to value or prioritize one thing over another thing. It's to say, well, I like vanilla ice cream, but not chocolate ice cream. So vanilla is on top of chocolate. Or to say, I like men more than I like women, or vice versa. Or to say, I like capitalism over socialism, or vice versa. You're valuing things. Or to say, I like family above career, or career above family. And this is the whole illusion of life, is thinking that there actually are differences between these things, that these things are important. So, when you become infinitely conscious, when you lose your sense of self, you realize that all of these valuations and meanings that I was creating, these were false substitutes for pure infinite consciousness and love, which is what reality has always been and can't be anything other than that. Because what love is it's not a human emotion. Love is the recognition that all values and biases are purely selfish and completely relative, and it's the surrendering of all that and the transcendence of that into absolute truth, which is love. The reason absolute truth is love is because when you stop selfishly evaluating things and attaching meanings to things, like thinking that, well, life is good and death is bad, or sex is evil and drugs are evil, or that person is good and this person is evil. When you stop making these judgments, what you're left with is not neutrality. What you're left with is the recognition that everything is of equal value. If everything is of equal value, if everything has no value, that's the same thing as to say equal value. Equal value is the same as no value, and no value is the same as infinite value. The value of absolutely everything in the universe becomes infinite. You become one with the entire universe, literally. And you recognize that the only thing that was keeping you locked into a finite set of value is because you were valuing one thing over another thing. You were making these distinctions and you were making judgments. And it's these judgments that have ruined your life and made you unable to be happy and fulfilled. And also separated you from God and from love. So what Jordan Peterson does not understand is that God exists. Not in a poetic, metaphorical way. God literally exists. You are God. This thing that is conscious right here, right now, you being conscious, that's what God is. I'm not talking about the human you. The human you is an illusion. I'm not talking about your self-image. That's an illusion. I'm talking about this state of consciousness that is occurring right here, right now, as I'm speaking. You are conscious of colors and sounds. This is a field of infinite universal consciousness. Love is not something you feel. Love is the recognition that you are everything and that you are one with everything and that you accept and surrender to everything without judging it or resisting it. And the reason that God is the top of the hierarchy is because God is truth and God is love. And the reason for that is because there's only one God. There's only one thing in the universe, which is the universe itself. Reality is itself. Therefore, to say that God is the highest value is just to say that reality is the highest value. Why is reality the highest value? Because there's nothing outside of reality, because reality is infinite. Anything you imagine outside of reality is a part of reality, by definition of how reality is defined. Therefore, the highest value is simply infinity or everything, which is to say love. This is something Jordan Peterson intuits but does not understand and cannot explicitly tell you because he's not conscious of these things. The highest value of all life, for all life forms in the universe, is love. This is not just a hippie saying. This is not a stage green new age teaching. I'm talking about absolute truth. You can become directly conscious of this for yourself. And if you just think about it intuitively, it makes sense too. What have you been chasing your entire life? Love. That's it. As a child, what did you want from your parents? Love. What did you want from your mother and your father? Love. What did you want from your girlfriends and boyfriends? Love. What did you want from your teachers? Love. What did you want from the video games you were playing and the movies you were watching? Love. What did you want from life? Love. What do you want when you eat food? You want to love the food. What do you want to do when you're hanging out with your friends? You want to love your friends. You want to do loving things with your friends, to your friends. Have them do loving things to you. Even if you're doing science, you're doing it out of love. It's a love of the exploration of the nature, the universe. You love science. Anything you're doing in reality, if you're doing it for the right reasons, you're doing it out of love. And then it's just a matter of how exactly will it be manifested. For some of you, it will be art. For some of you, it will be business. For some of you, it will be sex. For some of you, it will be raising a family. For some of you, it will be lecturing and teaching. For others of you, it will be exploring nature. For all of us, the highest value is love. And the reason that is because there's nothing else in the universe but love. The universe, the physical universe, your physical hands are a manifestation of love. That's what you recognize when you collapse the self and your mind. But you cannot understand this without collapsing yourself and your mind. The only thing that is preventing you from recognizing infinite love, all the things I just said, is your selfishness, your ego, and your attachment to a human identity, and your attachment to biases for different values. You value one thing over another thing. If you keep doing that and you insist on doing that, and you refuse to surrender that, you will never awaken to the fact that everything is love. If you are resistant to relativity, you will never awaken to infinite love. And infinite love is not a relative thing. Infinite love is absolute. And you might say, but Leo, so you're contradicting yourself. You're saying that it's all relative, and then now you're saying it's absolute. Which is it? It's both. It's a paradox because it's a synthesis of every distinction. It's a synthesis of every duality. Reality is one. God is one. You are one. There has only been one thing happening in your consciousness your entire life. You, this bubble of consciousness, is all that there is. There's nothing else. It's one. The only thing that was creating the illusion that there's more than one is your imagination. And that's what God is. God is an infinite field of consciousness of pure, unlimited imagination. It's all-powerful imagination. It's imagination that's so powerful that it can even imagine that it is not imagining reality, and that becomes what you consider reality. Physical reality is a dream. It's purely imaginary. but you don't think it's a dream because you're imagining that it's not a dream. Accepting this for most people is very, very threatening and radical because it erodes and deconstructs all power structures, all hierarchies, all value systems, even your idea of sanity and physical reality. All of it gets deconstructed. Not as a philosophy. Actually, when you fully collapse your mind, you actually go through a process of death and rebirth. This is not a metaphorical, poetical death and rebirth. You actually go through death. You literally die. The idea of you dies forever. And you say, oh my God, that's awful. It's only awful if you judge it to be awful. But when you realize that your judgment of it as awful is itself an illusion, what happens is that everything collapses into an infinite singularity of pure love. And then what happens is you discover God and you discover heaven. That's what heaven is. Heaven is not a nice place somewhere in the clouds where they feed you grapes and give you endless orgasms. Heaven is nothing other than the realization that there's no difference between anything. There's no value to anything. There's no meaning to anything because everything is empty and meaningless. Everything is so meaningless and so valueless that it goes full circle into infinite meaning, infinite value, absolute love. This is what every religious teaching has been about since the dawn of civilization. But most people who are reading these teachings and interpreting them are too unconscious and too selfish and too corrupt and too biased and too fearful to understand the teachings and to actually do them. You can't understand these teachings by reading them or memorizing them or by aping them through some 10 Commandment process. You can only do it by literally deconstructing your mind and your reality, losing your sanity, diving completely into nihilism, relativism, until you lose the sense of physical reality. And then you die. And then you're reborn as God. And then you are a walking God amongst men, and men look up to you as though there's something special about you. And there is. You've fully awoken to yourself as God. The universe has awoken to itself as infinite love and infinite consciousness and absolute truth. And the game is done. You recognize that all of your life was just a game that you designed to allow yourself to awaken and give yourself the gift of infinite love. And you cannot appreciate the gift of infinite love unless you've lived without it, which is what your life is. You have separated yourself from infinite love, from God, so that God could give you the gift of infinite love, which is just to say that you are giving yourself the greatest gift in the universe. And what is the greatest gift in the universe? The universe itself. I know it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to stomach. It's unbelievable. It sounds crazy. It sounds insane. What I'm describing now is a stage turquoise level of very profound consciousness and development that nobody you know has experienced. Your parents haven't experienced this. Your teachers haven't experienced this. The public intellectuals you listen to on YouTube, they haven't achieved this. And the only way you can understand this is by going through it yourself personally. You have to lay your head on the chopping block and get it chopped off. You have to lose your sense of self before you can discover the highest value in the universe. So as it turns out, the only obstacle to the highest value in the universe is your limited conception of yourself. If you were to surrender your limited conception of yourself, which you're terrified to surrender, you call that death. If you were to literally surrender that, you wouldn't die. What would really happen is that your sense of self would expand from the finite self to the infinite self. And then you would become illuminated, enlightened, awake. When you see pictures of Jesus or the Christian saints depicted in the Bible or on stained glass windows or on various kinds of, Christian iconography, they depict a saint with a halo around his head or even this kind of burst of yellow light, behind Jesus' head shining forth in all directions evenly. What does that represent? That represents a human being who has died. The finite self in that human has died and collapsed. His mind, the very notion of a physical existence has collapsed in his mind. The idea that he was ever born or will ever die has so collapsed in his mind because it was just imaginary. He collapses so deeply that he became an infinite point of pure consciousness and love. And that is what is depicted by that halo. It is not merely a metaphor or a myth. It's more like literal. You literally become an infinite singularity of love and consciousness. That's what God is. You become God realized. And that is the highest value, because that is the highest state of consciousness that consciousness can take. And everything that's happening in the universe, whether it's you going to work, you eating a cheeseburger, you driving your car, you having sex, you chasing money, these are all just branches and tangents off of the pursuit of love. You're doing all of these things as poor substitutes for the seeking of love. That's all you've ever sought. When you go, you seek a hamburger, you're seeking it for the love it gives you, that you feel when you consume it. When you're having sex with your spouse or partner, same thing. But these are all finite, material experiences of love. They're all limited. The love you have for your mother, your father, your child, your spouse, you might think that that's a lot of love. It's not. It's nothing. It's like a drop in the ocean. It's nothing. When you surrender all that, and this is what's so counterintuitive, you have to have the courage to take the leap of faith to surrender all of your attachments and all of your biases for your mother, for your father, for your children, for everything. Everything you love, you have to give up so that you can gain it all back and the entire universe as infinity. And so long as you're too attached and too scared to give it up, if you're too attached to give up Jesus or the Bible or your religion or Allah or Muhammad or the Buddha, you'll never actually realize what they realized. In Buddhism, they have a great saying which goes, when you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Because the final thing that will hold you back from complete God realization is your attachment to the idea of a Buddha or a guru or a Jesus who is above you. Anything you think is above you is a limitation to your true self, because that's a shadow that you have not integrated. Nobody is above you or below you because you're everything and you're everyone. How can anyone be above you? And Jesus told you this. Jesus said he is the Son of God. Does that mean he's the only Son of God? No, of course not. What it means is that his body was the incarnation of God, and all physical objects are the incarnation of God, and your body is the incarnation of God. All equally, none above the other. Jesus told you the kingdom of heaven was within. Was he speaking metaphorically? No. Was he just saying that because, oh, well, if you're just meditating and you're happy by yourself, then that's heaven? No. He was telling you literally that you're God, that you're love. But you didn't understand because you weren't conscious enough. So this is the biggest oversight in Jordan Peterson's work, and I don't blame him. It's not easy to accomplish this feat. The reason he hasn't accomplished it is because he's too stuck with the relativist shadow. He's too afraid of it. He's afraid that if he goes down this road, he's going to lose his mind, and he's going to lose all meaning. His whole life will collapse. His family will collapse. His career will collapse, all of that. And that's true. It might all collapse. This is threatening stuff. See, you have to think like this. If what I'm saying is true, it's not talked about very much in society. Or when it is, it's talked in corrupted ways, the way that religion talks about it. Why is that? Well, because either it's false, and I'm deluding you, or it's because it's so rare and so threatening that any time a single individual accomplishes this, it becomes impossible to communicate, because anyone you try to communicate it to who's just sort of like normal, a normie, who buys into consensus physical reality, you try to communicate it to them and they think you're insane. So it becomes virtually impossible to communicate. Because see, people want to ask you for like proof, like, Leo, prove it to me. If this is true, prove it. But you see, you don't understand the depth of the problem. It can't be proven to you in a scientific manner, because science itself and the notion of proof itself is something that your mind is constructing to create a physical illusion. You have to deconstruct proof and science. And no one can do that for you. I can't do it for you. You literally have to surrender your life. And of course, what's the last thing you will surrender? Your life. You're terrified. Fundamentally, the thing that is holding you back is fear of death. The thing that's holding Jordan Peterson back is fear of death, but also fear of relativism, fear of stage green, fear of postmodernism, fear of socialism. Fear. Fear in general is the only thing that holds you back from God and from love, because fear is the contraction of consciousness away from love. Whenever you fear anything in reality, what you're subconsciously saying to yourself is, that thing is bad. I don't want that thing. I reject that thing. I reject death. I reject terrorism. I reject slavery. I reject Hitler. I reject all these things. And the more you reject, what you're doing is you're creating shadows out of that. You're rejecting yourself, because there's nothing in the universe but yourself. So the universe is rejecting parts of itself. And because of this, you are tormented and you struggle. Because of this, you have health issues. Jordan Peterson faces health issues recently. Where are those ultimately coming from? A lot of those kind of health issues, especially autoimmune disorders, come from not merely physical problems, but from the stress that your body and psyche lives with every day. You're not even conscious of this stress because it's just a constant for you. The stress of just surviving and judging and hating and rejecting parts of yourself, disowning parts of yourself, and battling with your shadow boxing with yourself your entire life. This is very stressful on the psyche. It leads to disorders and diseases. It leads to dysfunction. The diseases that this leads to are not only individual, they're also collective. Because you see, the fundamental disease is selfishness and egotism. The fundamental disease that plagues Jordan Peterson is his own self. just as the fundamental disease that plagues you is your own self. And then the fundamental disease spreads itself through your words, deeds, actions, and thoughts and emotions all across the globe, and it synergizes with the selfishness of all the other people, 8 billion people on the planet. And together we have now a host of collective problems and dysfunctions and disorders. As all of our collective egos and selfishness and fear synergizes with itself, resulting in war, genocide, slavery, violence, exploitation, corruption, disease, pollution. Where is all this coming from? It's coming from the self, the limited self. It's coming from bias. This is what Jordan Peterson really wants to communicate to you, but he can't because he himself has not gone through the process of deconstructing his own mind and reality. He could do that, but I'm not going to hold my breath. So that's why I'm stepping in and filling in some of the gaps. It might have, I don't know, maybe it sounded to you like I've been very negative on Jordan Peterson this whole time, but actually I'm not negative about him. I think he's doing important work. I think a lot of people are at the point in their life where they need a lot of stage blue foundation that they don't have, a healthy one. And so he's fulfilling that function. But we also equally need people to help fulfill the function of stage green, healthy stage green. That's where the progressives come in. We also need healthy stage orange. A little bit of capitalism is not such a bad thing. And when you integrate all of these and then you go beyond that to the higher stages, that's when your life completely transforms. You think that you've watched some Jordan Peterson videos and your life has improved? You ain't seen nothing yet. Watch what happens when you fully integrate these 3 stages of blue, orange, and green, and then you move beyond that into what's called tier 2. Tier 2 is a whole order of magnitude beyond the lower stages. And then you can go even beyond that into this infinite love that I'm talking about. I'm pointing you towards what Jordan Peterson wants you to pursue, which is God or the highest value, right? So I've articulated to you as clearly as it's possible to do using language. You can't do better than this using language. But language, of course, is insufficient. Why did I talk about this? Is it for you to believe me and to become a cult member? No. I talked about this as a vision for what is possible for you. That is the function of religion. The function of religion is to show you your highest potential. And what is your highest potential? Your highest potential is infinity, of course. Your highest potential has no limits whatsoever. That's what I've shown you here today. Hopefully you've understood that. Now it's up to you to decide whether you want to pursue that. But also be patient. You are not going to be able to understand or to actualize what I just told you in a few months or even in a few years. It took me a few decades to reach this level of understanding and consciousness. And I'm still not done. I'm still growing every single day. So, my point to you is that if Jordan Peterson has introduced you to this idea of self-improvement and self-help and psychology, that's great. Now you recognize how important psychology is. Now let's take it to the next level. Yes, psychology is important. Yes, self-help is important. Spend a good 5-10 years developing that. Great. But what's even more important is epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy, and spirituality, and ultimately consciousness and truth. That's even more important. It's more fundamental. And so predominantly what I focus on with my teachings with Actualized.org is that I cover basic self-help sometimes as well. You'll find plenty of practical episodes that I have recorded in the past. But once you've gotten the basics of your life down and you really want to reach your full potential, you really, like, how serious are you about life? If you really want to see what's possible, you must transcend psychology and go with me into consciousness work. It's not an ideology. It's not a belief system. It's not a cult. You do the work for yourself and you discover the things that I say are true for yourself. And if you don't discover it's true, then it's not true. It's only true if it's true in your direct experience. And the bulk of my work is to help people to deconstruct their mind in ways that people like Jordan Peterson cannot, because they're too afraid to do it. See, my special gift or power, if you want to say I have one, is that from a very young age, I was so skeptical of everything that I believed nothing. I questioned absolutely everything until it killed me. Literally. I questioned the very fabric of physical reality until it killed me. And I was happy to do it because I knew that all of these things that people were believing in were just constructions. It was just all bullshit. It was just stories. It's all stories. Physical reality is just a fucking story. Your birth is just a story. Your death is just a story. Science is just a story. Your brain is just a story. Atoms and molecules, these are all fucking stories that you're imagining. You don't need them. Have the courage to go for what's really true. And how do you know what's true? I actually have a video called How to Discover What's True, but go watch that. But in short, how do you know what's true? You question absolutely everything. And whatever survives that process is what's true. And if you question everything and nothing survives, and you destroy the entire universe with your questioning, that's what's true. The entire universe was imaginary. And of course, that's exactly what will happen. And the only thing holding you back is just your fear and your laziness and your complacency and your being a sheep following all these other people, including Jordan Peterson. You're just one of his sheep. But hey, you know, I recognize the importance of moving people up the spiral. You cannot just take someone and leapfrog them across all the stages to the very top. Your psyche can't handle that. If you experienced the levels of God consciousness and love that I've experienced, you would be vomiting on the floor and you might even pass out and you might even die because it's so extreme. It's taken me years of laying the groundwork and deconstructing my mind and my reality to be able to reach these levels of consciousness and understanding. And so what I do is I guide people, serious people, to do that for themselves. And the only way you can do this is if you're very serious. This is not a casual pursuit. It is dangerous. There are risks. Your life is at risk. And that's precisely why, you know, people like Jesus and the Buddha, these were not moderates. These were very radical people. That's why they're so rare. It's very rare to find a person who's willing to destroy and throw away his entire life and even the physical world and his own sanity to reach something like truth. Most people just want to live a comfortable life. But at the same time, how comfortable are you? The problem is that when you're living a comfortable life, it's not very comfortable. The most comfortable life, counterintuitively, is to surrender your life. Then you'll have comfort. Until then, you're going to be whining and moaning about every little thing that rubs you the wrong way. And you're going to be shadow boxing with yourself your whole life. You're going to be miserable. And look at Jordan Peterson. A lot of times you just look at his face and he looks miserable. He doesn't look like a happy man. He doesn't laugh a lot. He holds bitterness and anger inside of him and fear. Now, this is not a personal attack on him. These are just normal human emotions that people have. And I would say that, in fact, he's better at handling them than most people. I think most other people would be less developed than him and handle it worse. Given the amount of pressure and fame that's upon him, that's not an easy burden to carry. But also, don't fool yourself with this idea that, oh, well, Leo, if I just kind of play it safe and I just pursue money and just a family and some sex and some of this kind of stuff, my life will just be good, right? No, your life will be miserable. Your life will be mediocre. Even if you become mega successful. Jordan Peterson is more successful than most people can dream of. He makes millions of dollars every year. Does this make him happy? No, of course not. Does this make him loving? No. All the same bitterness and problems and shadows are still there. Your shadows will stay with you no matter how rich you become, no matter how much sex you have, no matter what country you live in, what house you live in. That's not an ultimate solution to anything. The only ultimate solution is to give up yourself, quit resisting, take the leap of faith, and discover that you're God. That's the only thing that's worthwhile to do in life. Everything else is tangents and distractions and avoidance of that. But it takes a very rare individual to be able to actually do it. But if maybe you are such a rare individual, or you're thinking you might be, you found the right place. Watch my videos. My videos will help you to deconstruct your mind in ways that I think very few other teachers and gurus can help you to do. That's my specialty. That's what I love. See, what I love is deconstruction. It does help, if you're going to be deconstructing everything, to actually love deconstruction rather than to hate it. It's a beautiful thing. What I'm talking about is not nihilistic or depressing, even though it might sound that way to your ego. It's actually the greatest beauty, the greatest joy. There is nothing else quite like it. All right, so that's it. Now you got an idea. See, doesn't this make sense of things for you? Doesn't everything make sense now? All the culture wars, the progressives, the conservatives, the MAGA people, the socialists, the capitalists, Jordan Peterson, all of religion. Look at how much we explained. You might think to yourself, well, Leo, this took a long time. This took 2.5 hours. Yeah, it took 2.5 hours to explain all of fucking life to you. If you can't see the value in that, then I don't know how to help you. You got something wrong with your head. There's a trade-off between depth and length and also commitment. How committed are you to this work? I recommend you make this moment, this video, I recommend you make this the turning point for the rest of your life. See, you got a little bit of taste of it here for 2 hours. Now I recommend you devote the rest of your life to this kind of work. This is what life is about. You want the most meaningful life? Counterintuitively, paradoxically, this is it. The meaning of life is to deconstruct all meaning and to surrender all meaning, and then to take it all back through infinite meaning and love. And then enjoy your life. That's it.